Good evening. What a lovely place. I think this was Gertrude Stein's concept that they brought to life here at this bookstore, Books and Books in Miami. My God, the cafe and restaurant and courtyard, magnificent. Thank you so much for having me. This is an absolute pleasure to be here in this wonderful, beautiful place. This will not shock you because you don't know me, but I started out as a poet, and the idea of writing about a crime is the farthest thing that has ever been from my mind. I have never pictured myself in any way, shape, or form interested in guns, blood, dead bodies, and I've tried to stay away from them for as long as I can and as far as I can. And usually even when we're watching TV at home and someone draws out a gun, I'm the first person to reach for the remote control and change the channel. This won't surprise you, but the fact that I ended up writing about an assassination was a complete shocker to me. And the way this fell into my lap, so to speak, was that, as it was mentioned earlier in the introduction, this political assassination that I wrote about took place in September of 1992 in Berlin, Germany, at a restaurant. And two gunmen, one with a machine gun, the other with a handgun, walked into the restaurant and started shooting at the 8 guests who had gathered over a dinner party that night and shot them all. 4 died instantly, and the other 4 survived. Now, of the 4 survivors, 1 ended up being my house guest for several weeks. And I knew very little about him. He was a friend of a friend who was coming through town in New Haven, Connecticut, where I live. And as I was trying to cook dinner in the evenings, keeping him company, trying to be a good host, I would be chopping onions, and he would be sitting across from me, trying to help and making conversation. And I made the mistake of once asking, "So, what happened to you in September of 1992? And then the rest was history. Just like Scheherazade, he would tell me a new installment of what had happened, not simply the night of the murder, which to many minds might seem as the most interesting or the most intriguing part of the story. But actually what I found most fabulous and most engrossing was the way in which the investigation and everything else unraveled. So I would be making my dinner and, going about my own thing in the kitchen, and he would be giving me the next day within the investigation, the next day, until he came up to the trial. And by the time he reached the trial, which is about a year into his storytelling, I thought that I should take a trip to Berlin, Germany, and visit other people. So, of course, I set all of this up to say that when you have a writer who has started out as a poet and is generally very squeamish around anything having to do with blood, then you get a crime story told in a way that few crime stories are told, which is that against everybody's advice, rather than talking about delaying the crime so the readers would be interested in reading the story so they get to the gruesome crime, halfway through the book or 2/3 down in the book, being as squeamish as I am, I get rid of it in the first 5 minutes of the book and say, let's move on now, And I hope if and when you do decide to read the book, you agree that in a way this was not only a poet's look into a crime, but also a woman's look at a very, very male-dominated, macho story. And the reason I call it a male-dominated, macho story is because the killers were men, the people who died were men, all the people who subsequently get involved were men. and so I guess it was for me to try to look at this very, very intriguing story and say, how would I look at this? What would I find interesting in this? And what is it that would make such a gruesome story really intriguing for all readers from a perfectly new perspective or completely, let's say, revolutionary perspective? And you'll tell me if I have achieved at creating that sort of perspective. So, that's how it goes. I mean, I get rid of the crime, and what I follow through with pretty diligently, because after I took my trip to Berlin, the subsequent characters that I met, one seemed to be more intriguing than the other, and that wasn't because any one of these heroes, any one of these survivors, investigators, were in any shape or form perfect people, but rather that in their imperfection, in their fallibility, they all together contributed to bringing about a very, very historic trial and verdict, which by the accounts that I've received from several legal historians happens to be one of the most important trials in the history of Europe in the 20th century. And you're probably just as surprised as I am why none of us heard about it. Well, that's precisely why I decided to write about it, because it seemed like a very, very important story that had gone untold. So you know that the night, you know that there are 8 people sitting, 2 people walk in, 1 person stands guard, 4 people get shot and die immediately, and 4 others survive. Now, the first person who was in my kitchen talking to me was one of these 4 survivors. His name was Parviz, P-A-R-V-I-Z, and of the very first questions that I asked him was this. So what did you do when you first got home? It may not seem a very smart question to many of you, but it was really curious to me. What if one of us in this room survives such an atrocious crime, and the police comes, we go to the headquarters of the police, we get interrogated, whatever it is that they do, fingerprinted, I don't know, and then it's all over, and several hours later, in his case, 4 or 5 a.m., and now you're all alone, and you have to go back to your life as usual. You have to go back to your own space, your own apartment. What is that like? So that was one of the very first questions that I asked them. I said, so what happened to you the next morning? What happened to you when you were done? And they said, you can now go home. And so I will read a very short passage from the moment he arrives home and what are his thoughts, and then follow through with some of the other characters thereafter. These microphones are wilting. It's okay? Okay. Calls. Okay, sorry about that. I broke the microphone. Okay. Thank you. Calls. All he wanted to do was to make calls. He paced the perimeter of the apartment, from his living room couch across the television set where the news was on, to the balcony for air, to the telephone on his bedroom desk, to the stove in the kitchen where he was boiling water for tea over and over again. His morning routine had vanished. The thought of eating or going to bed did not enter his mind. He dialed his secretary. I won't be in today, he told her, and when asked why, he broke into an endless sob. Were you robbed? Is your mother dead? Is your daughter missing? Came the secretary's frantic questions.